Good morning. Thanks very much, Zayan, for that excellent introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Zayan mentioned, my name is Nelleita Omar. I am Research Director at the Center. We're a centrist think tank based in KL. I am honored and delighted to moderate for you this final session of KSI's 2022 Malaysian Outlook. So on a topic that's occupied the minds, the tongues, the keyboards of Malaysians in recent years. Yeah, wherever we are on the political spectrum, I think many of us would agree that since the last general election, Malaysian politics has gone and will go through some really seismic changes. So to give us a glimpse of what we might expect to see, as I mentioned, we have Professor Bridget Welsh, as well as Dr. Oe Sun. As per our previous sessions, our speakers, Professor Welsh and Dr. O, will each deliver their individual remarks, followed by what we expect to be a lively Q&A session. So please do drop your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A pane, and we'll do our best to accommodate each one. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Welsh to begin the proceedings. Professor, over to you.
Yes, good morning, and thank you very much to KSI for inviting me. And it's really a pleasure to see many good friends online. I look forward to seeing people and friends in person soon. I'm going to move quickly to my slides, and let me see if I can find them here. Let's see if I've got them in this context. Yes, here we go. So I basically only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to be very concise in some of the things that are going on and some of the trajectories as things move forward. And I expect my colleague Isan will add on and expand and differ, hopefully, on some of the perspectives that I have here. So let's first talk about potentially GE15. I think at this particular juncture, it's a 60% chance that the election will be held this year. I know for some people this may seem like a low number, but I do think that the pressure of 40% of wanting to stay in power and to continue to have access to patronage is still very strong. And while there has been clear pressure to move towards elections, particularly by pushing state elections, I think that there are still considerable resistance to holding elections right away and giving up power. I think that what we see is that this pressure is driven predominantly by factions within UMNO, particularly involving the legal cases of one former and one current leader of UMNO, which are going to continue to be a driver for trying to secure their positions, particularly before the end of the party elections that will be held by the end of the year. We see now we're moving into the fourth general election, state election, since GE14. The Johor will be held probably, it looks like, shortly after Chinese New Year. So in order to reduce the voting for people returning, this election at this particular juncture, based on voting trajectories, suggests that UMNO is likely to easily favor to win. But I think it is going to be a fascinating election to see some of the major changes that are taking place, the new political forces, the greater competition for the same pool, both within the opposition base of PH and within BN itself. Interestingly to be watched will be in particular the impact of Bersatu, as well as Pejuang taking away from Bersatu. In terms of looking at the elections more generally and examining voter shift, I'm sharing with you an election projection that I've done looking at voting patterns in the last 3 state elections, and also assessing and including trajectories for Undi 18 and its automated registered voters. And if elections were held within the next, based on the current trajectory of voting patterns, what we would see is a return to power for BN, very comfortable, a majority, not a super comfortable one, but a majority nevertheless. We would see a significant contraction for Pakatan Harapan, but it a rise in support, particularly for PN, particularly for PAS in many of the East Coast states, but not only that. There will be some more of a kind of, PAS will become a much stronger national party based on current voter trajectories. Also, I expect that Bersatu will also gain, at least in a couple areas based on voting patterns. And in particular, what's interesting to see is that PN and PAS have been able to capture a lot of the younger voters. And this, of course, is something that is interesting to watch how it will play out with the new voters that are coming in. The second sort of big discussion point I want to raise to thinking about ahead is to look at the way political mobilization is changing and how the nature and the fabric of politics is changing from below. One of the things that people don't fully appreciate is how impactful COVID-19 has been on Malaysian society. It created a sense of insecurity, the rise of bread and butter issues. We can see rising inflation in particular, but we also see it reinforced and new inequalities. Class politics is extraordinarily important in Malaysia. And one of the reasons BN is more successful traditionally is because it's able to capitalize on those that are less economically advantaged. We see politically a rise of nostalgia, a perception of the past in a more less positive way than it actually was for many. We also see the rise of anger and disengagement. And so with the new inclusion of new voters, we're going to see much lower turnout. And we're going to see persistent reliance on race and religion, particularly for Malay mobilization, because many of these parties lack the same institutional base that they had of the past from a perspective of mobilization. So they're going to rely on kind of quick and kind of traditional modes of engagement. We see a rise of state nationalism in Sabah and Sarawak, which is really, I think, in some ways unchecked and is a very divisive force in Malaysian society, in part because of the inadequate accommodation to the concerns of people in these areas in Borneo. And we see that while youth politics is seen as more important, it would also depend on the fact that a recognition that there's going to be different forms of mobilization among young people. And so what this means is that the nature of politics has shifted, that we see greater insecurity leading to a lot more uncertainty and more ambiguity. So it would seem on the forefront that BN is returning, but it's actually returning in a very different type of context. We're seeing at the same time a third dynamic, and here is my major third point in the short 10 minutes that I have to talk about the nature of what's happened to political parties and alliances that are much weaker traditionally than they were in the past, but there is also a kind of fundamental transformation taking place. Within Pakatan Harapan, there are serious leadership issues. There's a denial of political erosion that has happened to its base. The MOUs that in terms of that is signed has delegitimized Pakatan Harapan among its political base. Many people don't think about them as even the opposition anymore, given the fact that they are shoring up the current government. We see a situation where they will likely have some institutional reforms, potentially an anti-hopping law, but these reforms lack a resonance among ordinary voters who are concerned with more bread and butter issues. In Pakatan Harapan itself, there is much more pressure for internal divisions. We're going to see party elections for two of the major parties, PKR and DAP, ongoing. And what is meant is that there is a lack of direction among the leadership within Pakatan Harapan and a lack of connection to the society in terms of how to move these different forces together. And as we know, we see the impact has been the rise of new opposition forces that are challenging Pakatan Harapan, especially more saliently in some areas, such as, of course, traditionally in Borneo, but also we'll see among younger voters. And Johor will be a test of that. UMNO, we will continue to see persistent divisions that are unlikely to resolve themselves because the party election is not till the end of the year. GE15, the drivers of the elections, potentially with Perak, is another one coming down the line. If they're unable to push to GE15, will continue to percolate, in part because there has been no major resolution, and the sides have very much become much more should we say, dug in their heels. The current vice president, deputy president the party. Tokmat is a kind of a bridge builder, but he also is unable to manage the structural forces that are really pushing for to remove some key elements within the party, and this I think is a very big challenge for UMNO. We are also seeing not only the shifts within the opposition, major changes will continue within the forces of BN, PN, and PAS, and I expect that what is interesting is to see is how the relationship of competition will emerge between PN and PAS versus BN. And I think this will probably deepen extensively. I don't see Padrong as being a major force in that context as we move forward. Now, let me conclude in my 10 minutes, and that I would say that as we look towards the next year, this year, we have to keep in mind that we're not returning back to the past from a perspective of the landscape of politics. We are in terms of the practices of corruption and patronage, but not necessarily from the perspective of the new dynamics and the drivers of mobilization. We're seeing a different type of electorate with greater demands, expectations, and unfortunately weaker governance. There's a larger, I would say, governance and expectation gaps on the part of the government, because there are clearly very reactive politics. A lack of resilience. There's a rise of resilience, a rise of empowerment within the society itself, which I think has been changing the government-state relationship. But we also see very troubling and concerning areas of anti-elitism, a lot of anger and dissatisfaction in Malaysian society, which in some ways is not being able to be adequately contained or addressed because of the core issues that are happening, whether or not it's the floods or others. But it's interesting to see that there is less political polarization in that dynamic. So as I look to Malaysia this year, I see I see continued persistent forces of political instability, both at the elite level and within society itself. And there's a lack of clear leadership to be able to deal with that. Malaysia is in some ways on autopilot as opposed to being piloted in a very clear direction. Let me close there.
Thanks very much, Professor. That was a really incisive and yet comprehensive analysis and summary, I think, of the trajectories going forward and happening today. There's lots to unpack here, I think, but before we get into that, we'd love to hear the opening remarks from Dr. O. So Dr. O, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I was about to use the same term, namely autopilot, but of course my good friend Bridget used it first. I think a lot of worries have been expressed as to the various political permutations and combinations that have been going around over especially the last 2 years since the stepping down of Dr. Mahathir. But I think we should clearly realize that these are political changes and not necessarily political revolutions. Malaysia, at least the modern Malaysia, has been, its social economy has been largely driven in a sense by the private sector as well. So when you do have such changes, for example, I see that in terms of foreign policy, in terms of trade policy and so on, no matter it's Dr. Mahathir or Muhyiddin Yassin or now Ismail Sabri, who is the Prime Minister of the day, they would very much sort of retain the same or similar sets of foreign policies and trade policies. And ultimately, because this country, it's a very, well, economically open country. So no matter who is in charge, as long as the business persons are given the opportunity to carry out their tradings, of course, nowadays limited by the pandemic, as well as their various production activities, then I don't think they mind so much. So we are not talking about a wholesale revolution, political revolution of the country, whereby we either revert or transform into some sort of theocracy or autocracy and so on. It's not like that. In fact, I think anecdotally, a lot of business persons, they will actually like the fact that the government is not an overwhelmingly strong arm one. So that's number one. I think we are also seeing, in a sense, the dissipation of sort of what I would call the PH momentum, the Pakatan Harapan momentum. There was this euphoria, an outburst of euphoria when they took power, and then there was an outburst of dismay when they lost power 22 months later or 2 years ago. But I think that sort of, shall we say, very strong reactions as to whether the success or the failure of PH, it's perhaps not quite there anymore. And I think one key reason is, of course, the signing of the MOU, which, as Bridget said just now, in a sense, delegitimize the Pakatan Harapan as vocal and persistent opposition. I think if you go to some of these PH parties, I'm more familiar with DAP, for example, both the grassroots as well as some even quite senior leaders, they would question as to whether the party has lost its struggles and similar questions. So you saw recently a number of exodus of perhaps not really senior leaders, but mid-level leaders of DAP, for example, away. But well, they were not like some of those PKR leaders who either switch allegiance to the other side, or they would view themselves as independent but pro the government of the day. Many of these DAP leaders will switch to parties such as the Sabah Warisan Party, for example, which has sort of moved over to West Malaysia recently. So you could see it's sort of a disappointment with the parties sort of veering away from its original line of struggle. So if PH doesn't take care of this line of disappointment, it would, I think, very likely to see a repeat of many of its supporters staying home instead of coming out to vote in Malacca and in Sarawak. They are very likely to see a repeat of this, let's say, in Johor. In Sarawak, for example, DAP even lost deposits in the number of seats, which, at least to me, was unheard of. A lot has been said also about Undi 18, but of course, Undi 18 is not just the addition of new voters age 18 to 21, but also voters who are, of course, much older in age, who are now automatically registered. And I think some of us perhaps would have the bias of thinking that many of these younger voters, or at least new voters, would be necessarily more progressive minded. I think Johor is a good test bed as to whether there are as many, for example, the Undi 18 cohort of voters, or automatically register voters who are as conservative as progressive. I think you are likely to see a mix of both. It's just that the relative proportion would be either higher or lower than each other. We should also perhaps not think that this Undi 18 cohorts would be necessarily more interested in politics and thereby coming out to vote more assiduously. Those of us who have perhaps younger relatives or friends would notice a lot of them perhaps prefer to spend time with their handphones or laptops and doing a lot of online activities, non-political in nature, but very much concerned with lifestyle, fashion, and various other wonderful activities. So it is not yet certain that they would be indeed very politically active and even coming out to vote. So I think that it's a word of caution about Undi 18. Bread and butter issues indeed would take front and center during and in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. But then again, if that is the case, well, I think a lot of compatriots would perhaps run to the quote unquote, try and tested Barisan Nasional, which has been ruling this country for more than half a century, and they were seen usually as the one which disperse all these goodies and all these materials and all these resources. So I think that has partly to do, not exclusively, but partly to do with a resurgence of support for Barisan Nasional, not only for example UMNO, but also other erstwhile sort of dormant political parties within BN, such as MCA and MIC. And this is perhaps quite prominent also in East Malaysia. I'm from Sabah, incidentally, where you see money politics and what is very politely or euphemistically called developmental politics continue to be played in elections after elections. And indeed, you will see a rise of, shall we say, some form of self-help in Sabah and Sarawak. You would see, for example, social enterprise mushrooming in some parts of interiors of Sabah and Sarawak, whereby local residents would group together and try to, in a sense, market and make their own products, hopefully benefiting their local communities. But this sort of social entrepreneurial activities, I think, could only go so far. Because when you have the lack of very basic infrastructure, such as clean water, such as electricity, and so on, sometimes it's rather difficult to carry out with these social entrepreneurial activities. I think the fragmentation of Malaysian politics is likely to continue even beyond the next general election. Of course, as Bridget mentioned also within UMNO, I think the mainstream faction driven by the party president and his predecessor, they are very eager to have the election as soon as possible so that they will still control the candidate nomination rights. But of course, the Prime Minister of the day would like to push it to nearer to the full term, such that he could stay in power longer. So we really have to see this sort of internal dynamics within UMNO in order to gauge when the general election would come. But I think that this, again, the political fragmentation is likely to continue after the next general election, as UMNO is predicted to win quite a substantial amount of seats. But of course, other parties, not only PH nowadays, but PN as well as some other new contenders, they are also likely to win. As I always tell some of my friends, as long as you win about a handful of seats, let's say 5, then you would have a seat at the table of negotiation for forming the ruling coalition. And you might even get yourself a ministership and all your other 4 MPs, each of them are deputy ministers. So as long as that kind of temptation is there, I think the fragmentation would continue. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. O. All right, some common themes emerging from both Dr. Oates and Professor Welsh's presentations. I think I'd like to start off the session by asking a high-level question, perhaps. In your minds, do you think that the next general election will be a more policy-driven general election as hoped for in certain thinking quarters? Or is it still going to be driven mostly by narratives that appeal to race or religion, or some other, perhaps more mundane driver, such as seat strategy? What do you think, Professor? Let's start with you, Professor Welsh.
Yes, I think that from a perspective of the dynamics on the ground, the parties aren't able to deliver policy platforms that are very meaningful. I think, however, the policies that they're engaging on social welfare in particular are very important in terms of shaping the votes of the key constituents, such as young people and lower class voters who make up large numbers. And if we look at the reason why PN Persatu did very well in Sabah, and subsequently, I would argue, in Malacca, in terms of gaining vote share, although not seats, is because of those sets of policies that were seen to be beneficial to those groups of constituents. Because you don't have as strong party machinery, you don't have the typical social relationships, the social networks, and these types of the elements of elections have changed because of kind of things have moved to social media. So we have, and the parties themselves have become much weaker. So those policies do matter. And I think Pakatan Harapan's weakness is in some ways that it was a government of austerity. It did not necessarily benefit large numbers of more socioeconomically disadvantaged voters who voted for them in large numbers to get them into the power in 2018. So what my answer here is that policies do matter, but it is not a policy platform election in any meaningful way. But I do feel that bread and butter issues are very important. Keep in mind that we've now seen this current government in some configurations have been in power 23 months, longer than Pakatan Harapan was in government. And there will come a point where they become the target of discontent. And we've seen these in moments of that. And the bread and butter issues are very serious because of the rising cost of living and the deepening of inequalities and the impact of COVID-19. And the social welfare nets that they've expanded are not necessarily adequate for large sections of society. And we can see those holes ripping through parts of this Malaysia society. So I think that there is a need for policy reform if they're going to try to be in a position to move forward for the elections that make them more comfortable.
Thank you, Prof. Dr. O, what do you feel? Do you feel that it is going to be a war of narratives, or will the next general election be more policy driven?
Well, I think that, yeah, I think nowadays you could hardly differentiate between policy, narrative, ideologies, and various other socio-political items of or terms. The main thing nowadays, because of the pandemic, is indeed which party or which alliance would be able to deliver more helps or assistance or aids to those who are in need. And typically, as we saw, for example, the expansion of the M40, the contraction of the M40 into the M20, and corresponding expansion of the so-called B40 into B60, you would see that as much as, for example, a lot of us who are in middle class would like to talk high policy as to which direction this country is going and so on. Very soon we are but a job away from having to to depend on handouts if we lose our jobs and so on. And thereby you would see people having to sort of lower their expectations from policy differentiation to the more well, again, bread and butter issues, right? As to which particular coalition would be able to deliver more helps to me and my family. And if that counts as policy, yes, this will be a very much policy-driven election. But of course, as a developing country, it has more hues of the more basic needs as to which party can present themselves as more efficient in handing out those needs. Yeah.
Okay. As a social welfare policy researcher, I certainly hope that both of you are correct. I'll be looking forward to seeing the developments in the next few months. I'm going to pick up a question from the Q&A chat box, sorry. And this, I think, speaks a little bit to some of the emerging analysis around voter apathy and the real quote unquote impact perhaps from Undi 18. So the question goes, do you think voter turnout for GE15 will be able to surpass 80% like GE14? Professor, let's go to you first.
So I do want to add one thing to the previous question, and I do think there is one narrative that I think will be very important, and that is the narrative of what is of stability. What we can see is that this discussion of the business among politicians is trying to appeal to the businesses to say we are the one that is the most stable, put us back into power in that context. And what we do see is really very interesting tensions within the business community between those that recognize that the current system is not necessarily viable from the perspective of leakages and corruption and so forth, but at the same time, it's a system that they know, and they were very hard hit and by the combination of the pandemic and, of course, the uncertainty of political transition. And so this is, I think, going to be a very interesting narrative for capturing parts of the middle class, Chinese voters, some of the business community. And I think that is, going to be quite pivotal from the other elements of the class dynamic. Now, to turn to the question of voter turnout, it is inevitably going to drop because the numbers of people who are being included is much higher. And keep in mind that the automatic registered voters are, in fact, disproportionately the larger number of voters coming in this 4.8 million or whatever numbers you want to look at, because the numbers do vary depending on which seat you look at. But what we add and numbers and how, but keep in mind, these are people who weren't registered to vote. If they weren't registered to vote, they're not likely to come out to vote. And unless you have large numbers of people who are going to mobilize them, and you have very weak forms of political mobilization, a lot of discontent with the political process. People are not concerned with, do not see the choices. Now, this said, I think traditional voter turnout will still remain high. Malaysians do invest in the system, especially during a general election. So I do think there's going to be a lot of turnout, but I think statistically the numbers are going to drop, both within the automatic registration and among younger voters who don't necessarily see that. And we will see, I think, also low voter turnout, for example, in the Johor election coming, because a lot of voters who are in Johor and Singapore who may not be able to travel back. So we're going to see these numbers continue to drop. We've seen drops of 10, 15% in some parts and among some groups that are quite significant. And a lot of that, in my own view, in voter turnout, there are a number of drivers. One, of course, is COVID, and that's largely among older population. The second driver is largely among people who are disengaged or unhappy with the political process. Now, if Pakatan Harapan chooses finally to change its leadership and to offer a different type of slate, then we might see that turnout level come higher.
Thanks for that, Professor. And there might be also the factor of which party or which candidate to vote for. There seems to be, spoiling for choice in the next election, which could actually drive down numbers as well. Dr. O, what about you? What are your views?
Well, I have very similar views, namely because you have an expansion of the voter base, and many of these voters that did not register in the first place. That means they are not interested in voting. So unless you have something very exciting to try to make them come out to vote, they are unlikely to vote as well. Those who are 18 to 21 years old, there's no automatic guarantee that they will be much more enthusiastic in politics, even though in recent months you saw some of those you saw some of those street protests and so on organized by very young people, but those are activists. As to whether that would indeed expand to the rest of the Undi 18, I think we are yet to know. So looking at these sort of factors, I don't think we would have as high as 80% of voter turnout in the next general election.
Yeah. Yeah, I think many analysts would tend to agree with you there, Dr. O.S. Welsh, Professor Welsh. I'd like to, I think, just last two questions because I'm mindful of the time constraint, and I know, Dr. O, you need to catch a flight. So I think the second to last question I'd like to ask is just to pick up on Professor Welsh's earlier point about the narrative of stability. So I think, yeah, that is definitely one of the drivers that's probably going to bring back a BN into focus in GE 15. But I think the other half of that point is also about whether that stability can be maintained. So do you think that there will be a greater priority placed on putting in legislation around ensuring full terms are served? Professor?
I think what will be interesting to see will be the impact of the anti-hopping law and what the implications will be in terms of, sort of shifting the dynamics in terms of the inability to form new alliances or new different groups within the particular period of time. But I think that this will be something that will be tested repeatedly in the very beginning. So I don't think it's going to be an easy transition in that area. And keep in mind that, there are problems inside political parties. The irony about BN using the narrative of stability is that they are largely the party, especially UMNO, that has contributed the most to instability in the last 4 years. So I think it is a very ironic type of dynamic. And I think that the problems that are driving instability have to do with governance, have to do with leadership. If you had stronger leadership and more clear vision in leadership, you might have greater stability. And I think what we do see, for example, in a period of time, the initial period, for example, of Muhyiddin Yassin's leadership in the very beginning was a period of stability because even though he was facing major political forces, he was able to have a clear direction. So I think these things need to combine with the other dynamics that are happening in the clear process. Of course, his leadership subsequently eroded from those issues, and ultimately instability led to his being removed from office or stepping down. I do think that we need to see these things as a combined set of factors.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Prof. Dr. O, how about you?
Well, I think I'm somewhat reminded of two politically linked sayings which I heard over the last few years. Number one is the fact that any coalition, or ruling coalition without UMNO being firmly in charge would hardly be a stable one. So because of various historical and other reasons, the saying would go that if you would like to have a stable coalition for the country, UMNO would not only have to be part of that coalition, but it has to be the driving force. It would appear that the happenings over the last few years would somewhat testify to that. The other saying, it's even more sinister one. And of course, this is from politicians saying that, well, you need to let the non-Malays, especially the Chinese, realize that it's an exercise in futility to change the government. Then they would revert to a quest for stability. And I think that is somewhat happening now as well, because the government did change in 2018, but in less than 2 years, it flipped back to the other side. And I think a lot of, well, I will be specific, Chinese voters, they were thinking that, well, since it's hopeless in terms of changing the government anymore, so why not we try to go for stability? At least we can do some business. Of course, those who could immigrate are already contemplating so, but those who could not, at least they need some stability in order to carry out their meager businesses. So yeah, stability is indeed a big factor in this respect.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. O and Professor Welsh. All right, I've just been alerted that our final speaker, YB Dr. Alexander, is ready. And so unfortunately, we will have to put the session to a close. I would love to propose to KSI to have another session purely on politics, because it's very clear that there's much more to unpack here. But yes, in the meantime, thanks very much again, Professor and Dr. O, for that really great panel discussion. And yeah, have a great day, everybody else.
Thank you. Thank you very much for moderating this session. Thank you.
See you later,
Thank you.
Dr. Professor.
Bye.